thanks everyone for coming. This panel is on the public-private partnership in surveillance, myth or reality. And I'm David Robinson, and I'll be moderating. We have a diverse and distinguished group of people up here on the stage, and I will let each of them introduce themselves and speak to the issue at hand. But let me just sort of give you a map of the territory. To my right, I was going to say to my far right, but it's probably not politically descriptive. But on the end here is Josh Mendelson, who is at Engine, which is a group that provides policy advocacy to early stage startups that are often based out here in the Bay Area. Beside him is Jimmy Schultz, who is an internet entrepreneur with 20 years experience in the tech field in Germany, and is also a former German parliamentarian, so has both hands-on technical and also first-hand policy experience with the tech and privacy issue as it arises in Europe. I'm David Robinson. I work with a small team of computer scientists in Washington, providing technical advice to nonprofits and governments. Paul Robinson and you. And thrilled to be here today. Marie Georges is an independent expert on privacy and policy issues who, among other roles, is an advisor to the Council of Europe on privacy matters. Regan McDonald does privacy and other policy work for Access based in Europe, and really deserves the full credit for pulling together this amazing group of folks. And Brad Burnham, Union Square Ventures in New York, a distinguished and experienced investor of startups, but also someone who has really made a mark on the policy scene. Speaking as a Washingtonian who works on tech policy issues, I can tell you that really in the SOPA fight that so many of us were engaged in, Brad really played a key role in bringing entrepreneurs' voices to the table in that discussion, and I think it's a role that we're all glad to have seen grow to other policy issues as well. And with that, I will ask each of our panelists to give a few minutes, or let me just say just one or two words myself substantively about what we're about to talk about, and then I'll hand it over to Josh and we can work down the line. So the question, as the panel is titled, is myth or reality, and I think we've learned in the last 9 months since the Snowden leaks that it's both a reality of a partnership and also a reality of sometimes a non-partnership between the private sector and the public sector on surveillance. So we've definitely learned about cases where people are being paid by the government secretly to convey various kinds of information, as some of them may even be being overpaid, as we recently learned in the case of Sprint, which is now being sued for having overcharged the US government for its surveillance needs. But at the same time, so in the case, for example, of Google, we've seen both that there is secret request traffic going on that the Snowden leaks unearthed, but there's also raw hacking, if you will, of infrastructure. So not only was Google answering secret requests subject to legal compulsion in the US and elsewhere, but at the same time, unbeknownst to them, the links between their data centers were being tapped. And so one of the things that we've learned is that not only do individual citizens not understand necessarily what is going on or are not in a position to know what's going on, but even the companies themselves have some more knowledge than the public has regarding their role in government surveillance, but knowledge that is, in all likelihood, materially incomplete. And I think that the policy question that I'm hoping we'll be able to get at today is, as activists, citizens, people who care about privacy, what can or should we reasonably expect to do about this? What is the role of the private sector vis-a-vis the public sector that we ought to hope for or aim toward? And with sort of that as a framing question, I'll turn it over to Josh to start us off.
Cool, thank you, David. Well, you sort of alluded at the end to where I'm going to go with just a handful of opening remarks. One disclaimer or disclosure I should throw out at the beginning is I actually started my career working at the Department of Defense, and so I felt for a long time like I was sort of on the other side of this debate, and in truth, that's not really the case at all. In fact, what we've found for anyone who's been in any sort of security, particularly cybersecurity, sort of circular universe, we sort of always assumed that either the US government or some other government was out there obtaining information that they wanted. What's been so shocking in these disclosures has been the sheer scope and the breadth of the information that's being sucked up, and the lack of discrimination in how that information is obtained and utilized. So certainly it's great now to see more people having this discussion and being part of this debate. Small anecdote, I remember my now wife, I met her and I learned that she worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I was like, oh, this is awesome. She's finally going to know what keeps me up at night. And recognizing like these are big issues that really only the folks at like EFF and a handful of other places cared. So not the case, and that's really exciting to see, and it's nice to see all of you here. What I will say, however, is that there's a natural tendency, at least in journalism writ large right now, to assume that companies were absolutely complicit in what was going on and had far more understanding than one would like to convey. And I really think that that's not the case. Certainly there are the telcos who I put in a different category in a lot of ways, and certainly we know now that Sprint is making quite a bit of money off of their engagement with the government. But when we're talking about tech companies, when we talk about the Googles and the Facebooks and others like Dropbox, who are a bit smaller, young startups, this wasn't a line of business that they were in. And I think that every executive and every developer you meet there is somebody who, if they weren't doing the job they're doing now, would be in this room and would be listening to this panel, would be engaging on this issue. And we're all really aligned ideologically. And so with that, really, I would say that we need to be focused on where do we go from here, what's changed and what needs to evolve. And my argument is it's all the more reason why, as a developer of a product, as the user of a particular offering, it's incumbent on both of us in that equation to make sure we're doing our best to safeguard the information that we don't want to have shared. And we can't really have faith in our government. We certainly shouldn't have faith in governments that may want to obtain our information for any malicious purpose. But there are plenty of other actors who we know, bad actors who we know, can just as easily exploit important information to you. I'm thinking of data breaches. We don't talk about that as much when we're talking about security and surveillance, but I think in a lot of ways the problems, right, the technical problems, the root problems are the same. So consequently, my perspective is very much one of this should be a really good wake-up call for all of us that love to build products quickly, deploy them quickly, utilize them quickly. All the more reason why we need to get really good at understanding how we secure that information, protect that information, and secure and protect our users.
Thanks. Jim?
Well, we all lost trust, I think, into the governments and to companies who are dealing with our data. I started off developing a software around 15 years ago we called Big Brother, and it was able to do exactly what the name implies. And Germany at that time was talking about, we were an ISP internet service provider too, was talking about in Germany, the government, about having a law that would force me to have a black box in my server room, in my holy server room, which will spy on me and my customers. And at that time, I understood what we have developed with Big Brother was, well, not just only a tool for billing and charging internet services, but it was also a weapon. And then I joined an expert group of the German government, fighting it for 2 years against that law. It didn't succeed, so I decided to switch the side of the table, became a parliamentarian, which took me another 9 years. Now, we, after the Snowden revelation, everyone, I think, understands that our privacy is in great danger. And what do we do? What can we do against it? Who of you in the room is using WhatsApp? Well, if you ask in a school class of 7th grade, almost 100% of the young kids will use WhatsApp. All their communication is done by WhatsApp. I asked my party and the parliamentarians, 93 of our parliamentarians in my party who's using WhatsApp, and about 60 were using WhatsApp for internal communication. That's ridiculous, because we know that we are spied on. We are parliamentarians. We're talking about secret things. I told them, don't do it. You are going to be spied on. And they didn't believe it. It was over a year ago. Now, I think everyone understands how dangerous using tools like that can be. And I have a lot of people you can, and it's quite easy to encrypt your data, to save your data. And it's your responsibility to do so. Because you lock your car when you leave it. Of course you lock your car. Because there are laws against to steal a car, but of course you lock it just to be sure that it's not stolen or robbed. And the same thing, you have to lock your data and secure your data, and it's quite easy. There are tools, there are subsidiaries for WhatsApp which are encrypted, very, very good, and they are secret. And these companies can't be forced to give their data away because the data is so encrypted that it even can't read the data themselves. Not secured data. The companies can be forced to give it to the governments. For example, using Gmail, using webmail, using any mail client, which is not encrypted, the mail provider can be forced to give away your data. Using unsecured chat software, using unsecured phone software, all these brings the private sector, the companies, into the situation that they have to give their data away on laws there are for illegal interception. But if you secure your data yourself, they can't be forced to do so.
Thanks. Marie?
I will be talking also as a practitioner. I have been 30 years in the Data Protection Authority in France and 4 years at the European level for writing the Directive of '95. It's difficult for users, people say users, to understand what's going on. But I think that the more computerization is going in the daily life of people, more and more. Before it was only inside the enterprises, inside the state. Now it's more and more in our lives. People can more and more understand. For years and years, since '81, in Europe we translated the American principles on data protection, which never came out as being binding. We did it in Europe, the same principles. The same for private and public sector. When you collect data, it must be fair and transparent for specific purposes, and you don't collect more data than necessary, and you don't keep them more than necessary for the purpose. Plus security. That is the principles that you invented in America, miraculously, in the 70s. We still wait. When we heard 2 years ago Obama saying that he would put on the table this consumer privacy bill of rights, we said, oh, okay, I won't die without having seen that in the United States. Well, today I'm afraid that we don't talk any longer. And this is a real problem, because I can assure you, I've been making cooperation all over the world, in all countries, South Korea, in Africa, in at least 5 countries, in Latin America, those principles, these principles which are preventive from abuse, both in the public and the private sector. They are shared every day. When you talk with people, they completely agree. There are no differences. In the world, the area in which there is a huge differences between people is the freedom of speech, the length of it, the limits. But under these data protection principles, they are the same. But as IT are evaluating, there is a need to adapt. And what did Europe? They took this idea of the independent agency that they are in the United States. I learned recently that the first state in the world where there was this kind of mechanism to make things going was in Sweden in the 17th century. It's a small country, it's amazing. And we did that because we have those data protection authorities, that people say, to adapt, to show how those principles can be worked with the developing of data of Now, about surveillance, I have to say that for a long time I've known some points of it from the United States. The first time was when I had to deal with the question of PNR, the passenger name record that US was asking from everybody going to the United States, the reservation data. And when I saw that, I'm economist basically, when I saw the data the American administration wanted to get, there was this, the amount of the ticket. What is this problem? What is the link between the price of a flight ticket and terrorism? Tell me.
Maria, I'm sorry, but...
Okay, I can always stop. You know, you understood what I meant. So, well, what I think, to be short, it's really time, and so many people are saying that to the United States. It's the interest of private sector, individuals, and government also, to be sure that they do what they have to do and no more, to get those principles adopted. And I have to tell you that because of some NGOs, American NGOs, your government came 2 years ago as observer at the Council of Europe, the committee of this convention I was talking about. And now everybody is asking that your state has to come to that convention. It has a world portée, yeah. It is open to third countries. It is not at all political. It is not. It's only human rights. It's not, as I told you, only principles seen by Europeans. In Europe, we protect people, no matter their nationality, with regard to a data protection.
And we should return to this because that's the difference between the...
Ah, that's terrible. You can't believe it. How can you continue with IT services all over the world and say, we protect Americans and not the non-Americans? Are you kidding? You have to stop that. Okay? Now, we will discuss about mass surveillance afterwards. Okay,
Thank you.
I'm glad that you're so passionate about this. It's nice to have more passion. And I think we should be more angry about these revelations and about not having the security of having our privacy protected. And I think one of the points that Marie really touches on from the EU perspective is this difference between the collection bit, which usually relates to the corporate sector, and the use. How can that data be used? And this was really kind of the foundation for this panel and for this debate that's been happening, which really discusses and gets to the core of, if we're looking at privacy, if we conceive of privacy as an international human right, a fundamental right in a lot of regions, and we perceive it as what it's supposed to be, which is basically control. Control over your personal information and control over your identity. Then it's important to take a big picture or holistic approach and to look at all of the factors that are involved that do lead to privacy risks. And so in this sense, I think in today's day and age and after the revelations, it's become absolutely clear that whatever corporations know or whatever is online or collected in an electronic format is known and can be knowable by third parties. And that certainly includes intelligence services. So from my perspective, as a privacy advocate, I see the two as very intimately related. But that doesn't mean to say, as Josh brought up, it's not about necessarily attacking companies and talking about the complicity, whether or not they're working with them or to what extent and to what legal basis this was based on. But what we know from the revelations is that whether or not they were aware, whether or not they were complicit, there was access happening. So a lot, from a reform perspective, I think it's important to look at both the collection side. So on the one hand, those that are collecting and processing data should do their best, and not do their best, but should and must, close those backdoors and secure the data that they have. But then, to take it one step further, we should be rethinking different models and think about the collection of data. We need to be collecting so much data. And I just want to throw out a few things for discussion. And the first is, I guess, the most blunt regulatory way to do this, like what's happening in the EU, is to pass a binding regulation and to regulate corporate collection, to collect less data, to implement things like privacy by design, or implement very hefty fines if there are any breaches in the privacy regulations. But at the same time, if we're realistic, and I would really like to be proven wrong about this, but it doesn't seem like it's in the cards for the US to join basically the rest of the world and to implement kind of comprehensive regulation that would regulate company collection. But the tech sector is all about innovation. So if privacy is going to be protected and respected, if it is, as we are seeing now with the revelations, becoming of consumer interest and therefore good for the bottom line, then what are some different approaches that we can do? On the one hand, the law that is going to pass in the EU will have quite hefty fines for companies who are in breach of law. So economies of scale would say that companies from the United States operating outside the rest of the world will have to comply with other data protection regimes. So would they change their policies just for the EU and the others and not for the US? Or would this be a market interest or an economy's interest to get them to adopt their own policies without regulation? And then the other question is, are there other business models that we can be exploring? Do we have to rely on big data and the monetization of data for the way that we use internet services? Now that it's becoming, if consumers were given the option, for example, to pay for their security, maybe they would. People are buying songs on iTunes all the time, when in the beginning of the internet world, well, we're still struggling with this, people thought that no one would pay for music because now we have the internet and everyone wants to pirate it. But we know that people do pay for music as long as it's available and they have the right services to do so. So maybe they would also pay for security. And then the other question, if we are still operating in an age of big data, when data is the currency of the modern age, we should actually be conscious of the currency that we're carrying
and the currency that we're giving away. Because at the moment, most consumers, most users of these services feel that they're using these services for free. And in fact, they're not free. We are trading it. And we are not really conscious of the fact that we're trading this. And this is what, again, comes down to the control and to the power point of privacy. It's not about not liking a company's policies, therefore you don't use it. If people are aware of what they're doing and what they're actually giving away, and they're actually informed of the risks, then they can make an exchange. And the situation would be much better from the user perspective.
I want to bookmark that to come back to, but I want to let Brad
There's lots here to come back to. So, you know, I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I'm going to start by saying I don't think this discussion is really about privacy. I think it's about trust. Because I think that there is enormous value that we get when we can trust some entity with our data. We can get forms filled in automatically. We can get search queries that are more relevant. We can get, I work with a company that does language learning, and they watch every single click that a user does, and in the process they're able to group them into different learning styles and adapt the program for the learning style and improve the experience grammatically for the user. But boy, that is invasive. I mean, they're watching every single click, right? So I believe in collective intelligence. I believe in the opportunity that the internet has created to create this sort of superorganism of humanity that involves collective intelligence. So I worry a little bit that when we focus too much on the notion of privacy, we'll drop into these protective shells, insulated by crypto and sort of isolated from the rest of the world, isolated from the opportunity to create value in this data. But that said, we have a huge problem because there is really no one that you can trust out there right now. There is no structure within which you can trust anyone. So would you rather trust a government or a company? One of the problems with trusting a government is, Marie points out, is the U.S. doesn't have a relationship with anybody other than a U.S. citizen, and for some reason thinks that they're not obliged to respect the rights of anybody other than a U.S. citizen. That's ridiculous. Google actually does. They don't make a distinction between a U.S. citizen and any other citizen. For if you're a Google customer, you're a Google customer. And obviously Google has a financial incentive to serve those customers equally and to respect them equally. And so it's kind of tricky to decide who to trust in that situation. It gets trickier when you realize that that even if Google thinks they're respecting the data, they're being hacked by governments and not protecting the data. So I think that there is a problem with trusting a corporation. A corporation is really financially driven. They're going to try and maximize the returns for their shareholders. I think I could argue that many internet services actually favor, if they think about all the stakeholders between users and partners and shareholders, they favor shareholders more than they should, because a lot of these consumer-facing web services are actually created by users, and all the value is contributed by users. That's one of the points that Reagan makes, that the data is a currency that you contribute to create that value, and I think that most corporations don't fully respect that. So I think it's a challenge to trust them, but I think it's an equally big challenge to trust a government. I think that the approach that the EU is taking is a little scary to me, because I worry that the results of actually very well-intentioned regulation that's designed to protect the interests of users will have the perverse consequence of actually entrenching the existing companies that have the resources to manage that regulation, and it will cut off the innovation that's created all sorts of interesting new companies. So our challenge is to come up with a market structure that creates the proper incentives, but by the way, it's not just a market structure, because if anybody, one of my favorite things on this whole topic is a series of lectures by Evan Moglin from Columbia, if anybody's seen those. He makes a point which I think is really important, and that is that this is not a transaction between me and Google. I give you data, you give me mail, because it actually has an environmental consequence that ropes in anybody else that I email with. So I may agree for that trade. I'll give you the data, you can read my mail, but they're also reading your mail if you're mailing me, and you never agreed to that trade. So we can't just allow the market to solve the problem. There's a sort of an externality like pollution that we have to manage with some kind of social construct. So that's just a whole bunch of thoughts about, what works and what doesn't in this case.
This is an amazing conversation. It's a huge conversation, and I'm going to try to focus us in on a couple pieces of it with the foreknowledge that it's going to be unsatisfying and that there are other pieces that we won't explore. But one thing that I heard in a lot of what people said that I really would like to come back to is this distinction between users and customers. So most Google users are not Google customers in the sense that they're not revenue sources for Google. They don't give money to Google. For the most part, they receive services in which the advertising revenue covers the cost of the service. This is, obviously some people, you can buy storage or you can buy apps for your domain and have a more, privacy protective setup potentially. Or you can, of course, you can go to a PO box or someone else who will be in the business of, their business model is they get revenue from you and use it to provide the service that you're using, which is sort of old school these days. And I guess what I want to ask, especially for folks here who've got the entrepreneurial perspective, is, in the last 9 months, as we've started to learn more about how even the world's leading experts in protecting data from attack, who work at places like the security teams at places like Google, are not actually able to protect data from various kinds of attacks. So I guess there's really two parts to the question. One is sort of, have we started to see people want to incentivize the companies that they work with or the companies that they trust to have different incentives? Do you think that stands to make a difference? Maybe we can start, Josh.
Yeah, there are a couple of thoughts embedded in sort of the universe of what you've said. Let me start by saying that it is important to note when we're using an example like the NSA and interfacing between the data centers of Google and a number of other companies that was one very good security team up against another very good security team. And so I want to characterize that as a different sort of challenge to deal with, and where I think consumers tend to be far more vulnerable, which are data breaches and other very targeted attacks. One of the points that I can't miss making is just the simple fact that we live in a world where your data, one of you mentioned data as currency. Like, that's actually true, and I'm failing to remember who did this study, but there were a set of leading economists at the University of Colorado, and the study was in an obscure journal, economics journal. I feel so bad that I can't reference them or remember their names, but somebody will Google it. And so these guys, there was 3 men, and they went out and did a series of analyses. Very good methodology, and found that consumers readily give up their information when they believe they're getting a valuable service in exchange for it. And being this was an economics paper, they went so far as to actually ascribe a certain dollar value to each piece of information. But what they unequivocally found was that no matter what you do, if you are providing a useful service of some sort, people will happily turn over their information with full knowledge that they're turning over their information and full knowledge that that information might be more vulnerable. So understanding user behavior, we then find ourselves in a realm of sort of saying, okay, well, what can we do best to secure that information? And weirdly, I tend not to really come up with the divide between who's a customer, like, are you paying the company versus are you simply a user and you're being monetized on top of that? At the end of the day, I think most of these companies will take everyone as a customer. Like, I would think that a Google user, maybe you're getting Gmail for free, but frankly, like, you're still very much a customer. And I think Google would say that. So skipping that divide, it really becomes, well, what can we do as innovators to really help make sure we're building the right constructs to protect those users writ large? There have been a number of approaches that I think of as market-driven, where you've got companies like Spyro that have popped up, and Spyro's truly innovative. Creation is not shared storage. There are plenty of shared storage offerings out there. It's that they do browser-based front-end encryption of the storage. So they never have your key. There's no way to decrypt it. They're encrypting it right off the bat. That's a great way to sort of have our cake and eat it too. But of course it requires that there be more innovation in that realm. We need more Spyros. We need not only the established companies to innovate to protect their users better, but we need more companies to pop up and find themselves willing to tackle this problem. How do we do better user security? How do we create better encryption algorithms? How do we create lightweight implementation methods for the systems that already exist? Go check them out at the demos. You can get Tor demo to you right now, but I promise you from experience, Tor is a pain in the ass to get going, and that needs to change.
Yeah, yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think one of the things for people who tried Spyro that's sort of working, that's sort of unacknowledged in a lot of these conversations, is that like Spyro isn't as much of a pain to use as Tor, but it's a lot more of a pain to use than Dropbox. And there are reasons. There are actually deep architectural reasons why that's inevitable, like the fact that if the service provider, and this goes back to something Brad said about like shells of encryption that enclose each user, if the service provider doesn't have the key to your data, then it follows, as an entailment of them not really having the key, that they can't do server-side search of your data for you, which is a nice thing that Dropbox does for people. And I think, and there are actually sort of in the computer science world, innovators working on things like search over encrypted data without decrypting the data. I mean, but that stuff that's years away, right, from being a consumer product. If indeed, years later when it's developed, it ever becomes a widely used consumer product. Certainly, that's not possible within the next couple of years.
It needs to be a feature, not a product, I guess, right? Like we need it built into the core, I guess is what I would say.
Please, I would like to intervene. We cannot speak banalization, we say in French, that monetarization of the personal data. This is terrible. We cannot live in a world where personal data are monetized. Personal data are our identity. And as you said, we need trust. And how to have trust is to be sure that you won't do anything else than which is legitimate to do. Huh? You see what I mean? We cannot leave people saying just like this, well, money, that personal data are money.
But we do live.
Either we as a user or customer, of course we will be all of us customers. I completely agree with the change in the economic model.
I would agree, but maybe formulate a little bit different. The contract we do with those large companies is not fair because we know what we get, but we don't know what we pay. We don't. I'm on the contrary side than you are. I believe that almost no one understands which data we will give to them and what is being done with these data. No one ever read the privacy contract of Facebook. It's 60 pages long.
There is
It's small. And if you ask, well, my children, 12 years, 13 years, 14 years old, of course they have never read it. And they have never read the WhatsApp contract, which says, and that's what they do, they send your whole address book of your smartphone every time you log in. And it's not just the phone number and the name, it's the birthday, every comment you put in there. Every time you log in, they send it to a US server. And they are allowed to do everything with the data. For example, Skype, which was said to be secure, they have in their contract, we are able to do legal interception. How if the encryption is secure? They can't, or encryption isn't secure.
So I'm going to disagree a little bit. I think that we have to figure out how to trust somebody. And I completely agree that users have a right to know what's being done, and that we need to increase the transparency of privacy policies. As you were saying that, Jimmy, I was thinking that we've gotten to a point in our lives where we don't believe we should ever have to open a manual to use any service. We should never have to open a privacy policy. It should be evident based on the architecture of the service that this is what's happening, and it should be completely transparent. So I completely agree with that. I think there's going to be some market pressure that will get us there. I heard earlier today that 30% of the people in Holland stopped using WhatsApp when it was bought by Facebook. Obviously, most of the people that you've spoken to stopped using WhatsApp, perhaps before it was bought by Facebook. So that's, I think that's a good market pressure. I think it should exist, and I think we shouldn't allow somebody to misuse that data and to continue to misuse that data and to retain the trust of users. So we should find better ways to service that data.
I wanted to come back to something that Josh had mentioned about this study.
And I think I'm familiar with it as well. But it really comes down to this issue of, again, this debate on whether or not, when we're using services that are technically free, if we are the consumers or the product. And it really comes down to incentives. So if a company really makes its bottom line from the mining and harvesting of our data, with which they sell to advertising companies, regardless of what you want to call the users of that service, they are in effect a product, and that undermines their ability to get real change. And there's no incentives from the company to make any changes, especially if you're relying on the market, because why would they? And that makes sense. So there is an issue, and this is why I push on the control part, because if we had more control and awareness, then this is what would shift the market. And we are already seeing it, and Brad did mention this 30% less users on WhatsApp, but there's also a load of privacy protecting companies, like one based in the Netherlands called XQuick, that people have been swarming to since the revelations. So I think there is movement to that. And on the terms of service issue in particular, I'm not sure if it's even possible for people to understand, or for us, anyone to understand, just how much can be gleaned about you, about your family, about your life, with all of the pieces of data that we're basically constantly using. There was a really interesting study conducted by Cambridge University about Facebook likes, just Facebook likes. And from an analysis of just those, they were able to determine with surprising accuracy a person's sexuality, their political standing, whether or not their parents had been divorced, whether or not they use or abuse drugs, all sorts of very, very, very personal and kind of intimate aspects about your life, not just where you live and what your credit card number is, but who you are as an individual and who you associate with. And that was just from likes. So I think it's almost impossible to get to a point where individuals, no matter how simple the term of service might be, it will be very difficult for them to understand the risks, which makes it certainly a challenge for companies to express those risks. But this is certainly something that we should be moving towards.
So we have about 20 minutes left, so I want to...
I would like to say something. I think more or less we agree on many things. By design, good.
You're not on the microphone.
Okay. You said that it was interesting to see those people who quitted 20% essential service. Would you like that we do the same thing with things we buy to eat? Suddenly quitting 20% people stop buying some tomato or so because they are not good? Or do you think that we should have rules, that we have tomatoes that can be eaten with being safe? I think data protection is a value, is a fundamental value, and respect, trust, and everything, and we should not have to stop to go to such and such service. Those services should be, and it should be an obligation for them to make good services in the line of trust. What do you do with it? It is very easy to explain what the data are done with. It's very easy. Except that in the US, nobody looked how to write that very easily for everybody to understand. And when you say that an enterprise is able to from like, the like on Facebook, is able to say who you are, your family, your sex, so life and so forth. In my view, and I'm sure within some more months or years, people are going to ask what kind of study can be done with all these big data. Can we make any kind of studies, any kind, without any protection for the individual if he doesn't want to participate to a study? You can imagine the kind of study can be done.
I'm sorry, but I do want to make sure that we get to people who want to
Yes,
ask
so
questions. Gentleman in the pink shirt.
I had a question, or really concern with the market-based solutions to surveillance online and to predicting our privacy online, is I think that while, Josh mentioned Spider Oak and there's other companies like Silent Circle, I think while that's a great thing that there are companies out there that are working to protect our rights online, I think the downside of that is you end up with an inversion of freedom isn't free. In other words, I see Spider Oak is free for 2 gigabytes, but then they charge you $10 a month. $10 a month may not be much for the people on the panel, but for many people in the world, $10 a month is a lot. And so you end up with this scale where, again, the more money you have, the more protection you have. And does that ultimately weaken, rights if we're saying human rights can be purchased on the open market versus what I think you were talking about in the big is, the human rights.
The answer is with the price of music. At the time, people were downloading music, which was not allowed. I said to everybody, if you could buy a tape recorder, a thing, for $2 or $3, the people will pay. We know that people are agreed to pay. But if it is too much, no.
I'm saying you shouldn't have to buy human rights.
Yeah, so to follow up on that,
At that moment, it's
it's a great, I want to just make sure that everyone knows that there was recently an op-ed either today or yesterday in the New York Times by Julia Angwin called "Is Privacy Becoming a Luxury Good?" which if you haven't read it, you absolutely should read it, describing the costs of the various services. She recently wrote a book, whose name is escaping me, but somebody should read it. Dragnet Nation, yes, is the name of the book. And the thing of it is, so she goes through and buys these different things. And part of the reason Spider Oak has to charge as much as it does, they're certainly interested in having the largest, user base in most businesses success that they can. But right now, this is a niche product where the demand for it is limited to, a relative handful of people who are lining up to pay for the privacy-enhanced version of file sharing. And so, the price point that optimizes for them right now is above what it would be if it was something a lot of people wanted to buy. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 in that regard. But Brad, do you want to jump in?
Well, I'll just say that, we're investors. I've been an investor for 20-some years now, and I really don't like to invest in those businesses, the privacy businesses, the businesses that where a consumer pays for a service which we agree should be free. And so that leaves us trying to understand how to invest in companies that do this exchange of data for service, and then how to morally invest in those companies with some conviction that they actually are either architecturally protecting that data along the lines of encrypting it from the browser going back in, or best case, somehow in the governance of the company itself, giving the consumers the voice and the access that allows you to feel comfortable that they're doing the right thing. Because if you just protect it architecturally, you end up in this problem of not being able to take advantage of services that you could otherwise offer, like searches on the server side or collective intelligence or something. So I'm not yet ready to give up on the idea that it's possible to trust an entity. I won't even necessarily call it a corporation, but an entity that provides the services and provides them for free.
There are two questions, one here and one in the back corner, and I want to get to, and thirdly in the center here, and I'd like to try and get them all. Brad, I just want to, we'll start over here and work this way. I just want to follow quickly on the thing about investor interest in things direct with revenue to make sure that I understand what you're saying. Is that because the growth and adoption curve, if you're asking people to pay, is so much slower?
Yeah, you put your finger on it. It's a niche, and there isn't a demonstrated broad market. I'm sorry that there isn't in some ways, but that's the reason.
So let's start in the back corner here.
Hi, Adi Grazani. My question is this. I want to know the role of private security firms. McAfee, Trend Micro, RSA have been selling and marketing security products. So I noticed one of the panel members early on said that people don't care about their security, it's their responsibility to lock it down. People have been buying these security products for years and years and years, thinking that because they have a firewall, their data is safe. I'm curious, when you look at the RSA vulnerabilities that were put into the products, what would the European Parliament, for example, do for products that are not as advertised? I mean, what's about a case of false advertisement and sell a product that has no vulnerabilities? What is actions that the EU Parliament would take or the private
So it's
sector?
the equivalent of selling children's pajamas that go up in flames?
Exactly. And marketing it as a security product. So, any of the panel members want to talk about that?
Sorry. Well, I lost trust after having heard that RSA was paying. And I lost trust into those companies a lot. The only thing you can avoid, well, you can use security product software, encryption software, is it has to be open source. And it has to be reviewed. Use open source software, encrypt every data, don't trust no one. That's the conclusion of what happened in the last couple of months.
Can I, so I think since is it quarter out is the last, so let me try and just, we have 10 minutes left. Let me get the questions onto the table from, I know the two, and if there are any others, and then I'll give everyone a chance to wrap up and respond collectively.
My name is Michael Hennick. I'm with Amnesty International. So this question, you'll get from that perspective. It's picking up on a previous point that was made up here about the monetarization of privacy. And the question is really about the dichotomy that was suggested by some of the panel between privacy and trust. To my mind, privacy is of course a right, and it's a right that's even to a certain extent recognized in this country if you send a letter or if you make a telephone call, but less so if you use the communications means we now all use. Trust is an emotion, and that's not, maybe it's an emotion that's useful to achieve a business end, to maximize profit or whatever the business objective is. But in any event, it seems to me that the comments made by the various panelists suggest that a market response solely is not going to safeguard the privacy rights. So, I guess my question is, surely we should be looking for something other than an emotional attachment to a company and a company's, I don't know, emotional or profit-based response as a way of addressing, of convincing people to trust. Surely there must be something more robust. And of course, the European approach does not seem, unintended consequences aside, does not seem to me to be a bad idea in terms of a way of ensuring that there are some basic ground rules to protect those privacy rights.
And then over.
And I'll be invasion sites. So there's a huge topic I feel like you haven't addressed collectively, which is context and sensitivity. If it becomes known to others that I prefer action movies, romantic comedies, the possibility for harm to use negatively. If it becomes known to others that I've searched for information on sexually transmitted diseases, potential harm to me and to others, my associates. becomes significant. So within the context of pretty much everything that's been talked about today, where does context and sensitivity come? That's a huge, huge factor.
So let me sort of take, I think those questions, oh, is there one? Sorry, yeah.
So the thing is, data has value at scale. It creates a $40 billion company in Google, and to go more extreme, if all medical data were public, it would save a lot of lives. But like, that's medical data, and clearly that's going too far. So how do we balance that? Because I mean, you can't. It's almost too easy to say, all data is ours and should be ours alone, because that's just not how the economics work. It scales up very, very powerfully.
All right, so, okay, last one and then we'll after it.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about a different sort of public-private partnership, which is the likelihood that governments are just commercially buying data from data brokers and using that information. And I wonder if you can comment on that and whether or not that, thinking a little more as a conspiracy theorist here, might be cutting down on their tendency to regulate that industry.
So let me just, I'm going to try and synthesize those questions into something that's a single sort of thing. And to the extent, if people want to jump in on pieces of what was just asked, feel free. But I think one of the core things here is, as Brad was saying earlier, we need some social structure to control, and there's something that's analogous a little bit to some kind of environmental thing where, okay, I give my data to this company, that company, even the people in Holland who are no longer using WhatsApp have given each of them hundreds of copies of their evolving address book to a US firm, and it's sitting on a US server somewhere, perhaps not deleted and whatever else. So I think that one question is, given that we do live in a world where there's enormous value, as was just said, in big data and lots and lots of use of it, and given that it seems unlikely that we're going to wake up tomorrow in a world where pervasive use of big data has suddenly halted, I think there's a real question about what are realistic controls or realistic possibilities. And one thing that gets tossed around a lot is controls on use. If there's going to be big, because a lot of the privacy conversation up till now has been about how can we limit collection, and that'll obviously continue for a lot of key areas. But I think one question is that I think comes up in the context of all of these questions that were just raised is, once data has already been gathered, how do we put ourselves in a place where we can still have a conversation about public policy that imposes some constraint on the way that potentially sensitive data is used, and that gives people some reason for some confidence or some trust that even after there may be companies that have a lot of data about them, nonetheless they are still in some ways protected against some of these possible harms.
Well, okay, David staring at me. One of the things that I'll say in the outset that's really scary, when hearing some of the reactions and some of the thoughts, is this notion that elected officials and policymakers are best able to protect users, and the policies they put in place or the bills they create and pass are going to be what will do the most to secure our protections. And at least my experience in Washington is anything but that. And I'd certainly say, like, when you look at those scales of trust, I like Brad's notion of trust. I think that's why all of us come to him for advice on things. And he's right. But one of the organizations that we least trust here in the United States, and I think this extends to a lot of countries, is our government. So why would we want to then put a bunch of folks who don't realize that taking a naked picture of yourself and putting it on Instagram or was it Facebook is a bad idea, and ask them to create better privacy practices and what data can and shouldn't be shared and how companies should use it? I mean, that's immediately getting us into a world where we're going to find chilling effects left and right and really quashing good innovation that could actually have the opportunity to both let us leverage data to do good, to save lives, to improve our lives, and at the same time, really find ourselves in a circumstance where we're just kind of stuck not innovating at all. The other thing I'd say, it's interesting in this discussion, so I'm no expert, no constitutional scholar. There are people in this room who are, but I keep seeing a lot of the same debates that we always have between freedom of speech and hate speech coming up time and time again. And I know that's a bit of a polarizing example, but in so much of how we think about, well, what's okay to share, what's not okay to share, what should we allow, what should we not allow, it readily lends itself to a world where it immediately evokes those debates. And the example I'll use that comes front of brain is a lack of understanding what the cultural contexts are for how we think about our online data and our online personalities. So in Argentina, for example, when you're looking at legislation primarily addressing copyright or takedowns on the internet, it's not about somebody believing their content is on there and being monetized inappropriately. It's because the society there is far more inclined to ensure that there is nothing said negative about you online. And so you'll find celebrities and others, and particularly politicians who don't like what their critics are saying, using copyright as an excuse to pull down unfavorable content. Certainly that's something we would normally talk about as privacy. I think in this case, though, we would, in this room, all agree that you should be allowed to say things about public officials that they might not love, and it should be able to exist on the internet. And I want to make sure we're really careful here.
So I want to just, actually, since you brought up also sort of Brad's suggestion, I want to mix up the order and do a ping-pong approach here. So I'll give it to Brad next, actually, to just wrap up. But also, I should say we're at our time, so there's each minute is borrowed at this point.
Okay, so real quickly, I want to start with the democracy advocates in the hostile regime and ask the question of whether or not you'd be better protected if you had a very sophisticated group of engineers working on your behalf and using a system that they managed for you, or whether you'd be better protected using a bunch of tools that you cobbled together with a bunch of inconsistencies that you had to figure out yourself. The problem with using a company or a larger entity to do that is you have to trust that larger entity, and I think we have real issues in figuring out how to do that. There's one way that I'd like to think about, and it comes back to this medical data example. It turns out, weirdly, that DNA data, a big portion of it is identical in all of us. And so it's on the one hand, uniquely identifiable, but at a very small level of abstraction, completely anonymous, because it's just a human. And so there's a lot of value in the aggregation of that anonymous data. The question is, can we find a way to separate an individual from their data? And can we do that in the context of multiple companies each pursuing a market opportunity, but regulated to prevent the kinds of environmental problems that I talked about in the future, earlier? That's what I'd like to see.
Okay. Well, as I stated earlier, and we all, I think, agree, we've lost trust into government, we've lost trust into companies, and it's theirs to regain our trust. But we can do something for ourselves. Some say the internet is broken because governments are spying on us. Some say the internet is broken because companies are misusing the internet. I say, let's reclaim the net. It's the net of us all, and we can reclaim it. And if you want to know, maybe by coincidence, some of you are in Austin for South by Southwest Interactive Conference next week. I'll be talking on Monday about how to secure yourself on the internet and how to secure your mobile phone.
I first want to thank the person who brought up data brokers. They are really the silent partners in this surveillance landscape, but unfortunately we don't have much time to address them. I just wanted to touch a bit on the cultural differences and the cultural approaches. Being Canadian and based in Brussels, having supported the EU's data protection reform efforts, and you might see some of our papers there to give you a little bit more information about what this regulation actually is and what it would actually imply. And having such a baseline standard and understanding what it is not that scary. But I know there is a cultural difference with regards to government regulation and government telling corporations what to do. But from the other side, think about it in terms of being in a country where data protection is recognized as a fundamental right, that your data should be protected by governments, by corporations, by anyone who collects your data, and being in a situation whereby there are mostly US companies or foreign companies that you are using at all times, that you have very little control over, you have very little access to remedy, and this is exactly the same thing that happened in the revelations with the government surveillance, is that there are, 99% of the world doesn't really have a way to seek remedy. So what can you do, and what are the steps? And there are certainly, as Josh pointed out, issues with letting governments decide on very technical and complex issues. And then you also have lobbying that comes into this mix, which becomes very complicated. But at the same time, setting a baseline standard, like this gentleman from Amnesty had suggested, really can set a good standard for what can become, what can happen, and innovation can be built on top of that. And I think that's referred to the contextual approach that this gentleman brought up over here, because the thing about the age of big data is that information can be collected about you and used for different purposes. And if it is stored for indefinite periods of time, you never really know what it will be used for, even though it was collected for a completely different reason. So I know we're out of time, so I'll just stop there.
So Marie, last word?
I have a question. What about the government buying personal data? I heard that from America for the last 20 years. People asking why those data are not covered by the Privacy Act. Okay? You agree? So please, Americans, help yourself for the best of everyone. And you won't be able to separate individual and their data very easily. Because it's our identity. So it cannot be sold as such on the long term. There is a right, this person said, it's a fundamental right, your identity, your dignity and everything. You cannot leave anyone doing what they want with, telling you prescriptively, you're going to have a cancer within 3 months. Oh, you said that you're homosexual. Of course, you did not know. Listen, are we going to have such a world? No, it's not possible. So I'm sure with all what happened, that America is going to think a little bit and come with the others that think in another way, and it will be for the best of your services, with their respect. And I am okay with the work. And I think in the Convention 108 in the Council of Europe, there are the International Chamber of Commerce comes, EISA come, people are very happy to come to listen to people with other practices and share those. So I hope that you will look at the Council of Europe website. The modernization is on its way. Completely open, there have been over 200 contributions of people.
We're going to have to end there and ask you to join me in thanking our panelists.